Hello, everyone, and welcome. It is a great pleasure to host Professor Nora Fisher Onar for today's book talk. Her book is titled Contesting Pluralisms, Islamism, Liberalism and Nationalism in Turkey and Beyond. Just a quick side note, this book of yours holds a special place in my heart because I've been such a fan of this book that its hard copy, it was gifted to me as a PhD graduation gift by one of my dearest colleagues and friends, Enes Ateş. We spent quite some time discussing your ideas in this book, so he gifted to me this book. So it holds a special place in my heart. On that note, we are very happy to have the opportunity to discuss these ideas with Professor Onar today. And I would like to warmly welcome you, Professor, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. And that's one of the most heartwarming things I think an academic could possibly hear. You spend years, even decades, working on these materials. I think part of this book began as some of the scaffolding is from my PhD projects back in the day. And so for it to be to resonate with you is extremely rewarding, and I look forward to engaging about the ideas with you. And it's also, the hard copy is, that's a very generous present because the hard copy is a little bit outrageously priced. And hopefully the soft copy will be coming out soon, and I can give you and Enes multiple copies of the soft copy because that is an extremely kind thing to say and do. And thank you. Yes, and thank you for having me on the show, and congratulations on this amazing work that you're doing, pulling together these conversations.
Thank you so much. Well, Professor Onar doesn't need further introductions, but just a quick background. She's an associate professor and chair of global studies at the University of San Francisco. Her research interests include IR theory, diplomacy, comparative politics, area studies, political ideologies, history and memory. And lately, she is also increasingly interested in the impact of technological change in international affairs. Well, if you're ready, I would like to shoot the first question. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, Nora Hocam, I think the first question is about the story of this book, honestly. Like you mentioned in your acknowledgements that this book was an 8-year journey. Wow. And it spanned multiple continents, written against the backdrop of massive transformation in Turkey. So the question is, what initially sparked your drive to dismantle this deeply ingrained Islamist versus secularist binary that has dominated the Western and Turkish political coverage for so long?
So, yeah, thank you for that question. And it's really emanates from sort of lived experience, right? We live in a complex world. We're complex human beings. And when I had the privilege of living and working on Turkey for many years, I constantly found that the Western gaze as projected on the country failed to account for very little of what was happening that I saw happening around me. And even elements of that gaze, which have been internalized in various forms of self-orientalization, I think, and also in the inverted form of Orientalism that we call Occidentalism. But all of these are ways of looking at the world that are built on binaries and binary logics. So the logics of Islamist versus secularist, or Islam versus democracy, or West versus East, or Europe versus Middle East, or Turk versus Kurd, or Alevi versus Sunni. These are all frames which, it's like all kind of cliches and all kind of forms of received wisdom, do describe actually existing cleavages in the world, but they don't actually capture the what in sort of the language of political science, they don't actually oftentimes capture the causal force at play when you look at important political outcomes in a place like Turkey. And so I'll give you an example that I think is salient for anyone following the country today. When you look at the ruling coalition that has been in power for over a decade now, its very existence belies the idea that Islamist versus secularist is the driving force in Turkish politics, because it's an alliance of secular right-wing nationalists with religious nationalists that was built around a common commitment to ethno-religious nationalism, although not identical commitments. They emphasize different aspects of it. And in the past year or so, this counterintuitive coalition, if you look at it from the lens of Islamist versus secularist as a binary, has been further complicated by rapprochement with a Marxist-inspired Kurdish movement that speaks a very different political vocabulary, and yet through some combination of expediency and desire to shape the evolving national project, have also kind of coalescing together in ways that make the traditional binaries unintelligible and irrelevant. And so having observed that happen in the context when I lived in Turkey over a decade ago, when this coalition was first forming, but also kind of looking back, I decided to look at major political outcomes that led to an opening or closing of the political system. And I found that over the past 200 years, almost every single time, it was some counterintuitive coalition that led to something like Ottoman constitutionalism or the Young Turk Revolution, or the transition to multi-party politics in 1950, or various outcomes of coups and elections. So in all of these cases, it's really a multiplicity of actors and forces at play in Turkey, some of whom come together in ways that help impel towards a more open society, and some of whom come together in ways that impel towards a more unitary dynamic for society. And so I wanted to challenge the vocabulary of binaries because I believe it has so much epistemological power, but it's quite impoverished explanatorily, right? So you have power in shaping the way we think, but not power in explaining the things we do. And so I wanted to provide an alternative.
That's a great introduction, I suppose, Hocam, because I think that's the inspiration point of the book. I think pretty self-explanatory into the also another theme that we want to explore, which is like the culture war narratives, which I think has been ongoing for many decades in Turkish politics, as you also mentioned and touched upon. I think your book, we tend to argue that your book also introduces an alternative reading of politics, especially Turkish politics, because of the shifting alliances between these like pluralizing and anti-pluralist coalitions across like different political camps in Turkey, which has been constantly changing, especially like thinking about some of the Turkish like political milestones, for instance, the 2016 coup attempt. Could you maybe briefly explain like how looking through some specific, all this specific lens changes our understanding of major Turkish political events? How does it play out, more or less?
Yeah, absolutely. And in this case, I would even venture to say that the major sort of tipping point in favor of what I call today is a Turkish Islamist synthesis. So it's a continuation of, but also an evolution of the Turkish Islamic synthesis of the post-1980 period, which itself has origins in prior kind of ideological formations and coalitions. So I would say that the actual tipping point was less 2016. That was a consolidation point, but the tipping point was in 2015. Actually. And that was with the realization on the part of the leadership of the Justice and Development Party at the time, President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, seeking to consolidate his executive presidency that he had been pursuing, through a rapprochement with the Kurdish movement, through openings with minorities, through what some people call sort of the Islamo-liberal coalition of the earlier period. And that was falling apart for various reasons. And there were also internal ruptures within the AKP that itself is a coalition of multiple Islamist currents and forces and constituencies and interests. And so I think the big shift actually came when the leader of the political wing of the Kurdish movement was able to make a small but very meaningful challenge electorally in 2015 elections, which led to the AKP losing its parliamentary majority, and this led to an impossibility of seeking an executive presidency through parliamentary vote, and then meant meant that when the internal sort of intra-Islamist rivalry that precipitated the 2016 coup presented itself, even Erdogan himself described it as an opportunity, a critical juncture, sort of come from God or come from the heavens, that was going to enable the reconfiguration of the political landscape and the political scene, and the transformation of institutions, the capture of institutions, in ways that would facilitate an eventual referendum on his presidency. And he did so through a very clear alliance with the far-right secularist nationalist party. And so, that's a lot of moving parts, right, going on. But I think the key here for me is, if I have time to explain it, if you don't mind, I think the key is actually the analytical framework that transposes to help explain 2015, 2016, 2025, 2023, 1908, 1950 is what is I think most helpful about the book is the way this framework can travel and be used to explain different conjectures when alliances for and against greater pluralization emerge and collapse. And this is a framework that is basically, if my complaint with the way that we think and do politics in Turkey, but also here in the United States, among many other places, is that it's based on a binary assumption that people either behave one way or another, rather than being complex and mutable. So if I'm against binaries, then I should want a framework that can capture complexity. And this is what my framework does, is it takes a sort of complex systems-inspired logic, and uses that to displace that epistemological power of the binary by instead thinking epistemologically in terms of complex systems. And a complex system, we have them all around us. Institutions are complex systems. Weather systems are complex systems. The human body is a complex system. I can't say that the reason I have a particular, symptom like allergies in my life is because of one thing, right? And not because of another. It's always a confluence of multiple forces that play in both structured and contingent ways. And so what a complexity-informed approach, thinking about Turkey's political system, any political system as a complex system, enables us to do, is to think about how different forces interact with each other. And the way that I do so is I think of the Turkish political system and any political system as having an agential sort of set of parameters, an ideational set of parameters, and a sort of contextual or structural set of parameters that interact with each other in dynamic ways, and they shape opportunities for entrepreneurial actors, interested actors, charismatic actors to seize the repertoire of ideas, and channel them towards achieving a specific goal at any given time. And I can elaborate more on that maybe in the next question. But the sort of thinking of 2016 or any other critical juncture through that lens, we see really that you have a charismatic, really sort of incredibly nimble political leader. Whether one adores him or does not is kind of besides the question. I think there's no question that Recep Tayyip Erdogan is a political animal, and he was able to sort of through a combination of his own performative and strategic agency and his ability to adopt and channel ideas towards actually changing the structure of the system, literally changing the composition of the bureaucracy, changing Turkey from a parliamentary to a presidential system. You really see how the complex system logics and the role of agency in it can be captured through this framework without reducing everything to just one, big important guy. And that's why I think the framework travels across time, and why, as we may talk about later, it also travels across places. So building on this idea that binaries have epistemological power, but are but reveal explanatory poverty. I think we see this at play in debates about Turkey by people from Turkey, irrespective of the Western lens, since at least the foundation of the Republic and the foundation of contemporary Turkish studies. And here, what I like to think the book is able to contribute is kind of upgrading of a framework that has been used to try and get around the binary for some time, which is Sharif Mardan's center periphery framework, but it's a framework that has considerable limitations, especially to explain the current period. And so I like to think of one of the book's, main contributions being to Turkish studies and specifically to providing kind of an update of that seminal approach, because basically prior to Sharif Mardan's very famous 1973 article on the center periphery key to Turkish politics, there was really people use this lens of sort of Western versus Oriental or modernist traditionalist, and that was imported into Turkish political science, oftentimes by scholars who'd been trained in elite Western context, and it meant that importing the binary with them, right, back into the Turkish kind of intellectual apparatus. And then you have someone like Sharif Mardan come along, who's a sociologist. He's a sociologist of religion. He sees things in muddled terms, and he says, okay, it's not really West versus East or Islam versus secular Islam versus democracy, but it's really about kind of on the ground dynamics and contests between the center, which has a particular ideological project that it foregrounds, and then diverse periphery actors, right, who in general share some features, some of those features being kind of more religiously conservative, but there's multiple peripheries. He's a little bit more reductionist when it comes to talking about the center as being kind of the space of secular and nationalist urban bureaucratic elites, which it is. I mean, but the center was always more than that as well. In any case, he offers this framework, which is quite capacious and can capture a lot of dynamics like intra-group tension, as well as intergroup tension. And so this is why I think it got so much uptake in Turkish political science. But then it started since the 2000s also to be kind of weaponized in populist discourse, as saying like, oh, well, the periphery was always, the poor periphery was always marginalized by the center, and therefore it's righteous for the periphery to come in and, push back against these top-down actors and illegitimate or inauthentic actors who don't understand the real Anatolia or the real Turkish, Muslim, kind of every person, every man, and so it's kind of weaponized, right? And so that led to people not wanting to use it as a framework that is both capacious and binary, because it's center periphery. And then it also became, I think, analytically relevant after the AKP captured the state. So now you have the former periphery now, owns the center. So what do you do with center? Center periphery collapses. And so here's where I think thinking about the coalitions that Mardan was kind of also trying to get at through the lens of pluralizing coalitions and anti-pluralizing coalitions that can be made up, a single person at any given time in the arc of their life might find themselves in one camp and then switching and be co-opted to another camp. You have that in the case of political leaders. You also have it in the case of, for example, journalists or, politicians who start out in one camp and move to the other. So it's not as if there's really nothing eternal about one's ideological orientation, much less one's, kind of practical politics, right? And so by reframing it as a pluralizing and anti-pluralist set of evolving coalitions, I think you can capture actually existing complexity in Turkey much more cogently, and also avoid the regrettable, tendency to then reduce everything to some conflict between binary, kind of formations, because that allows for that then leads to increased polarization, right, and allows for one block to beat up on the other so-called block, when in fact the blocks are more discursive constructions that have impact, to be sure, in politics and reflect real cleavages, to be sure, but it's a way to get out of that sort of rigid, conflictual, polarizing thinking. So that's what I really hope to do with the project. And I think it can also be useful to think about contests in other societies. Here in the United States, for example, we're told, also reinforced by the fact that it's a bipartisan political system, so only two parties. So it's already very binary. But nevertheless, it is through coalitions of voters that, this determined the fate of the country every 4 years when a president is elected. In 2000 and or in the 2000 elections, it was a coalition of progressives, liberals, and never Trump Republicans who elected Joe Biden to power. That fell apart in 2023, 2004, because progressives were upset at liberals' position on things like Gaza, and that led to kind of an implosion of the anti-Trump, relatively more pluralizing coalition. And not so much, for various reasons we can get into the nitty-gritty of it, but basically, Trump, as a charismatic, performative leader, was then able to harness another coalition of people who were freaked out by, progressive stances within the pluralizing coalition, and therefore propelled him to power. So, one out of every 4 African-American men voted for Trump, and something like 40% of Latino men voted for Trump, which seems, mind-boggling retrospectively when you look at his policies that he said he was going to do. But at the time, it was a coalition across ethnic groups, political groups, geographic groups that was worried about the particular way that actors in the on the quote-unquote left side of the spectrum were advocating for pluralism. And so it has real consequences, right? Even when binaries are important and do political work and lead to outcomes, it's coalitions across camps that often lead to the real tipping points in the evolution of a political system in more open or closed directions.
Thank you for this elaborate answer, Hocam. Well, another thing that we wanted to ask was the issue of neo-Ottomanism. Like it's certainly for quite some time became almost like a catchphrase for academics. In the book, you trace how neo-Ottomanism was utilized in the early 2000s as a polarizing and multicultural promise. But you also say eventually it turned into an anti-pluralist tool for religious populism. So the question that we would like to ask is, how did this transformation happen? And the specific political actors that we've been talking about, what role did they play in this, in shifting this trajectory?
Thank you for this really interesting question. Neo-Ottomanism was actually sort of the topic that first really grabbed my imagination as I was wrapping up my doctoral dissertation in the late 2000s. And I was struck by it because it was, getting a lot of attention, and it was one of these sort of things that was very visible all around. Anyone walking down the street in Turkey, there was, commercial merchandise that was being sold, that was heavily centering Neo-Ottoman themes. There was, foreign policy in place that was heavily emphasizing Turkey as a sort of a natural leader in its overlapping former Ottoman geographies of the Middle East, of course, but also the Balkans and the Caucasus. And there was, a lot of international attention to this emerging phenomenon. It was kind of an early forerunner of the kind of civilizationist arguments that other actors also, like, Russia and China, and increasingly actors in Europe and the United States, most recently Marco Rubio, have been advocating for, right? So this is it was a fascinating topic. But I felt that many people were simply reducing Ottomanism to Islamism, and in fact, it has a much older and more complex genealogy. So since at least the 1950s, pro-religious actors who had been displaced with the Republican Secularist Project were kind of nostalgic for the Ottoman Islamic past. But you also had more sort of secular liberal actors who were also nostalgic for aspects of the Ottoman past, and increasingly by the time that neo-Ottomanism was being articulated in the 2000s, that also took the form of nostalgia for not the Ottoman of sort of Fatih Sultan Mehmet the Conqueror, or Süleyman Süleyman the Lawgiver, but nostalgia for Ottoman Istanbul of the late 19th, early 20th century, kind of Belle Epoque Istanbul with its cosmopolitanism and its non-Muslim religious minorities in Turkey contributing so much to the culture. And so there was all of these different strands. And so what I tried to do in my work is to kind of capture how these strands form an ideational repertoire. And that ideational repertoire includes nostalgia for the Ottomans as, empire, as governors, as a powerful state. But it also includes nostalgia for the Ottomans as pluralistic and multicultural and multi-communal and tolerant. And then it also includes nostalgia for Ottoman Islam and, the role of the empire's leader of Sunni Muslims in many regions. And so since the 2000s, these different versions of it were in circulation and competing narratives. And therefore, a performative political actor, someone like, the professor foreign minister, Ahmet Davutoğlu, can articulate one version that foregrounds, but not too much, the Islam and the empire, and also offers the cosmopolitanism as a way of thinking about Turkey's role in the world. In the hands of other actors, and increasingly Recep Tayyip Erdoğan, as he pivoted towards a more religious populist and an ethno-religious populist, kind of platform, it can be used to really emphasize the importance of the Ottoman Turkish state and its legacies and power and the authority and gravitas of the Sultan. And so it has multiple uses. And I think it's evolution over that period of time from kind of having pluralizing promise to becoming kind of another form of sort of civilization's nationalism is really wrapped up in the agency of Turkey's leader and his usage of this neo-Ottoman political repertoire to navigate a number of shifting domestic opportunities and challenges, international opportunities and challenges over the years. So I don't claim to be able to get inside his head, right? That's something that maybe political psychologists like yourself might be better equipped to do. But I can see from his actions that he is a very astute political performer who's able to harness this repertoire, use it for different audiences at hand, and has used it to hold together the coalition with the MHP, with far-right nationalists since 2015, but is also can also use it in outreach to Kurds as part of the same, sons or heirs of Ottoman Islamic Empire that doesn't emphasize ethnic identity so much. So this is why I think it has evolved, and Turkey has been a forerunner in this regard, kind of advancing this toolkit of historical statecraft vis-a-vis many other countries in the world that are increasingly using this logic.
Brilliant, Hocam. Thank you so much. I mean, we've been also thinking about some comparisons while you were speaking. For instance, maybe this current synthesis between this, like the Turkish Islamist synthesis 2.0, maybe 3.0 with the Kurdish peace process and the like. So this a powerful anti-pluralist alliance, pro-religious, pro-secular nationalists combined together. What makes this new coalition different than the 1980s coalition compared with the neoliberal argumentations or the neoliberal movement at the time in Turkey? What makes them different?
Right, that's a great point. So, in the book, I basically argue that there have been 7 pluralizing coalitions since the late Ottoman period, and those tend to be coalitions that lean towards a more kind of multi-ethnic, multi-sectarian sort of vision of the collective project. And then, of course, there have been the movements that advocate for a unitary project. And that unitary project is typically framed as some sort of a synthesis between Turkishness, ethnic Turkishness, and Islam is constitutive of ethnic Turkishness. So in the 1980s, when the generals were anxious about a lot of political fragmentation going on in the streets and the political violence that accompanied it, they stepped in with a very heavy hand and adopted the ideas of really it was the far right as sort of ethno-nationalist understanding of Turkish Islamist synthesis, in which the Islam was supposed to be compatible with nationalism and subordinate to the state. And so when I put this in writing in the book, it says the focus is on ethno-nationalist, or with the religious, if one wanted to include it there, you would include the religious in a parentheses. The difference with today is that the predominant actor in the coalition remains the AKP, and here it's the Islamist part that is more important. So it's not about Islam is just constitutive of Turkishness, but it's also about the public visibility of Islam in the form of symbolic practices, the way that people dress, and really like the monumental architecture, for example, the skylines of Istanbul and other places, the presence of visibly Islamic symbols and features in things like airports or, shopping malls are all ways in which the Islamist part, which is about the public salience of Islam as a code of conduct, is more evident. So that's why I call it Turkish Islamist synthesis 2.0. And I think this is a very fascinating idea that you raised about the ongoing engagement of the Kurdish movement, how this might evolve into a 3.0 version that also that contains some watering down, perhaps, of the ethno part, maintenance perhaps of the religious part, although a little bit watered down because the Kurdish movement is quite secular in its orientation, and maybe a stronger emphasis on the Islam is constitutive of both Turkishness and Kurdishness. So that's really interesting. I want to write about that now. I think that's a great way to frame it.
Yeah, we are looking forward to reading it. Well, thank you so much, Hocam. Despite the current Unitarian dominance, you highlight the emergence of new polarizers. It's such a perhaps the hopeful note to end because you also name them contesters, right? Mm-hmm. You point to the 2019 municipal opposition victories, the new municipality systems and perhaps regimes. You talk about youth and women, LGBTQ plus movements, these intersectional grassroots movements, basically. So the question is, do you believe that these diverse and issue-based alliances have the structural capacity, the power to overcome the current synthesis 2.0 eventually?
Yeah, I think it's a fantastic question. It really draws out that tension between structure and agency. And here my framework does help to kind of capture the multiple sort of values, as it were, that one could assign to, not values in the normative sense, but the multiple kind of the strength of force, so the capacity to exert agency of the different actors that play in this coalition. Because you're right, it is very grassroots. It's not, this coalition does not emanate from a lot of folks who occupy, structural power within the state or necessarily even the economy, at least not directly. But it is, a testimony, the fact that there's all of these different pockets and sources of kind of pluralizing resistance. Does testify to the intrinsic diversity of Turkey sociologically, right? And that's not going anywhere. And so it will continually percolate up again when conditions are ripe and arise. And I think that under competitive authoritarian conditions, this is a frame that is used widely to discuss the sort of Turkish regime form of recent years. Under competitive authoritarian conditions, such a coalition did have a chance of success. And that's why, but that success depends on, as for my framework, not just all of these little groups coming together and being bigger than the sum of their parts, but it requires vision, leadership, oftentimes a charismatic leader who can pull the different repertoires of the different groups, right? Of the sort of tree-hugging Black Sea grandmother on one hand, and the LGBTQ activists at Boğaziçi University on the other, and the business community behind the mayorships of large cities, as well, and it requires kind of a personality to bring it all together, and I think that the tendency to imprison folks who have that capacity, from Istanbul Mayor İmamoğlu, Ekrem İmamoğlu, to also previous leader within the Kurdish movement, Demirtas. These actually, indicate that these figures probably had some capacity to unite the opposition, and especially İmamoğlu. With Demirtas, it's harder for various reasons. So the fact that they have been in prison and the fact that there's been a kind of a more illiberal turn and clampdown on the various structural elements in place that could have allowed for the channeling of this new coalition of pluralizers is suggestive of recognition that the energies and the challenge was genuine, right, and was real. And so it will be perhaps a matter of time, a matter of watching and seeing when new opportunities, contextual or structural, arise to push for more pluralism. Right now, at the macro structural level of the international system, the conjecture is not very encouraging, right? Because you have in the United States, clearly a very hard turn to the illiberal right, and a willingness to manifest this internationally, and therefore a strong comfort with like-minded figures in other countries and parts of the world. And so I think part of the reason for the clampdown on some opposition political parties in the past year or so has been precisely a function of leadership recognizing that the global zeitgeist right now is not one that is ripe for pluralization. It's one where anti-pluralists at the international scale are gaining traction. But that just makes it all the more imperative for pluralizers who demographically in Turkey, everywhere in the world, continue to exist, figure out how to survive until the next chance there is to thrive.
Thank you so much, Hocam. Would that be the next project you would embark on? Because just how would compare it with the other examples you also mentioned? You're also thinking about some cases like India, which we have been more or less conceptualizing on. We have been discussing more or less in terms of the comparative politics literature, perhaps. But I think we had new emerging countries within EU, or let alone China and Russia, but we have other emerging countries that are more or less going against that pluralisms, maybe. What else do you have in mind in terms of going forward with this book project? We are really curious to hear about it also.
Yeah, I mean, it's really my contention that that this framework that I've developed that comes, emanates inductively from kind of thick observation of the case of the, late Ottoman period in Republican Turkey through to the present. So it's a really thick, Turkey-inspired story. But by the same token, I really do think that it travels, because when I'm looking at, the Turkish political system, you can also look at the Indian political system, or the Israeli political system, or the Hungarian political system, or the American political system, as likewise constituted by three interactive parameters. The actors who exert force in the system, the ideas that they appropriate, which are very powerful, but they're disembodied. It's not like, notions of justice or freedom or liberation or anything can have any force beyond what humans do with them, right? So actors have to appropriate the ideas. And they're responding to a series of scaled, opportunities and challenges, from micro to meso to macro. So local politics, party politics, scaling up to national, politics and contestation, foreign policy, scaling up to the international scale. So my view is, if this is a framework that, I generated by thinking about Turkey, I can just as well look at the case of, say, India, and see how Modi and the BJP are appropriating ideas of Hindu nationalism as a way to, seek to capture the Indian democracy and convert it into a more religiously unitary project. I think in India, the project of doing anything ethnically unitary is completely impossible, right? So there's going to be differences across the different countries. based on their specific characteristics. But you can look at the way that these ideas have been harnessed in the Indian case and what type of domestic laws and foreign policy implications this has. And I think you could do this comparatively across the any country or context where you have proponents of exclusionary ethno-religious populism vying with alliances for pluralism and diverse societies. And this is sometimes they use the metaphor. They say, well, you can't compare, maybe Turkey and India or Turkey and Hungary, but how could you compare, say, Turkey and the United States, right? Because the idea is like apples and oranges, or in this case, maybe like apples and watermelons, right? Like watermelon is so big. But my argument is that they're both fruits, right? Like watermelon is a fruit, orange is a fruit. And they both have seeds, so you can compare seeds across the two. You can compare, sugar content across the two. You can compare nutritional value or fiber value. So you can, if you disaggregate the political system and look at it from the perspective of its constituent parts and how they interact, then I think comparison is possible. So my next project will, in fact, be to compare patterns of illiberal turns and pluralizing resistance in Turkey and the United States over the past 15 years or so. I think the thing that really switches in my framework when you start applying it spatially as well, and not just across time in one country context, but comparing it across multiple country contexts, is that you really have to be sensitive to and honor the specificities of each country's context. So it's probably harder to do, comparative 200-year approach, but you can do a comparative, 10-year approach, or a comparative, and at least for starters, that's how I imagine it. And the other kind of direction where I think I can take this, and where I have begun to take this, is by scaling up this logic of thinking of systems in complexity terms to the international system. So right now, the book is about Turkey, and Turkey's political system is a complex system made up of these interactive, agential, ideational, and sort of contextual forces. But so is our international system that way. And there are different actors in the system, and those actors take the form of leaders at the individual level, but also you can think of states as actors in the system. So the leaders and the parties within the states are vying for control of the national projects, and then the national projects are being contested at the level of global governance, the level of bilateral diplomacy, and regional configurations, all in ways where we're advocating for a more or less open international system. Is this a system where only great powers have agency? Is this a system where, or is it a system where transnational social movements can challenge the hard power of great powers through a number of tools, that are available, and a number of values and norms that are available in, say, progressive activist repertoires, right? So I think that I've started to do that. I just recently published, I co-edited the special section of International Affairs that was published last week, using Amitav Acharya's concept of multiplexity. And me and my co-author, Indrajit Roy from York University in the UK, we are arguing that you can think about multiplexity in our age of great power politics as a moment when we have to wrap our minds around the complexity of an international system, but we don't have to feel overwhelmed by the chaos of it. Instead, we can look at how actors are appropriating ideas in response to shifting circumstances in order to push for a system that will inevitably be pluralistic, not in the political sense, but pluralistic in the diversity sense. But then within that context, how are they? How are actors positioning to survive and thrive? And with what hope? This is a normative question to our hearts. With what hope for better representing our genuine global diversity? So this is kind of an international relations theory direction in which I think the project can go. But the book itself is definitely, it's above all a interdisciplinary Turkish studies book, and then it positions to offer a framework for comparative political analysis. And in my latest kind of attempt to carry the idea forward, I can also envisage it working at the scale of the international system.
we are really joyful right now, I think, and we are full of new ideas. Thank you so much, Nora Hocam, for sparing some time for the
Oh,
podcast.
yes, of course. My pleasure, as always, to engage with you in your excellent work as such productive and agenda generating and community inspiring scholars. It's a joy to see the work that you do and help contribute in my own little way.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for existing. Well, we also would like to thank the listeners for clicking on this episode, and the book and its link will be in the description below, I believe. And if you want to go check it out, please do. It's such an inspiring book. And once again, thank you, Nora Hocam, for coming. And
my pleasure.
Thanks to the listeners as well.
Thank you. And just a message for your listeners, if anyone has any questions or wants to have access to aspects of the book and are in a context where open access can be difficult, I'm happy to share sort of, on a one-on-one basis, I can share features of my personal copy of the book in the digital format. I'm allowed to do that from a copyright perspective, so I'm happy to engage with listeners who want to probe further. And I'm really interested in learning what how folks may or may not find this useful.